ways that metafiction is used in children's books, and sort of the history of children's books as a medium and as a genre, and how that history lined us up to the culture around children's books that's very saturated with metafiction that we have today. And I just remembered another piece of paper I wanted to get out that I can't find. So never mind about that. All right, here we go. So the first question we need to talk about this is, what is metafiction? Most people will talk about it as writing about writing or fiction about fiction, which is still very vague and unhelpful. The most useful definition I've found is this one, which says fictional writing, it defines it as fictional writing which self-consciously and systematically draws attention to its status as an artifact in order to pose questions about the relationship between fiction and reality, which is basically a lot of words to say it's a piece of writing that draws attention to itself as a piece of writing, draws attention to the fact that it's a piece of writing. As Mac Barnett points out, it's most often used to foreground the artificiality of the fiction, which is to say it's used to take us out of the story so we can examine the fact that it is fiction. It reminds us that it's made up. Okay, so in terms of children's literature specifically, there are sort of three areas where children's literature utilizes metafiction that I'm going to be talking about. The first is the actual physical form of the object of the book itself. The second is illustration and design, so the way that books use images. And then the third is the content, so is the actual story that it's telling metafictive. And in order to look at these things, we need to first step back a little bit and look at the history of children's books in general. So for a long time, it was very difficult to make books at all. Pretty much every book had to be handwritten, every copy of every book. It could take years to make a single copy of a book. It was very time-consuming and very expensive, which meant why waste it on the kids? They can hardly read anyway, right? This isn't kid stuff. This is too fancy and grown up. You know, mostly they were making Bibles at that point, or prayer books for priests and things like that. The kids who did have books were like the really, really rich kids. Like if you were the son of a lord, you might have like an educational primer or an instructional book about manners and etiquette, that kind of thing. Even after the invention of the printing press, when it became much easier to make more books more cheaply and more kids could have them, they were still just making instructional books for the most part. It was still that culture that kids didn't really need literature. They just needed to be taught the things they needed to know and sort of sent on their way. Until around the 18th century, John Locke published some thoughts concerning education and changed the game. One of the main things he argued was that children love their liberty and their freedom. It's their #1 value, and they resent being told what to do, even if it's something they were going to do anyway. Like if I know personally, if I'm about to clean my room and someone says, hey, you should clean your room, I'm like, well, I'm not going to clean my room now. So with that sort of in mind, the best way to educate kids is to make the learning indiscernible from the play they would otherwise choose to do of their own free will. These ideas were very popular, by the way. John Locke's essay that he published permeated the public consciousness, sort of in the same way that Freud has saturated our public consciousness. Most people haven't read Freud, but they still talk about the ego and the id and stuff like that. They still know those words. That's kind of what it was like with this essay back then. And John Newbery was a publisher. He was a literary man, and he saw how people were seizing on those philosophies. And he took that opportunity. He started a publishing house specifically for children's books. And he really established children's book publishing as a viable business field that could be profitable. He did that by utilizing John Locke's philosophies. He started publishing storybooks for children. And he started marketing them as pretty little gifts. You know, they had really long titles that were like, a pretty little gift for, a pretty little present for young Tom and Polly, and, you know, whatever. And they would come with toys to sort of strengthen that association between reading and playing. This is also when you start getting educational toys becoming really popular, like blocks with letters on them and stuff like that, because people are really trying to strengthen that tie between learning and playing. So those changing attitudes really affected children's literature as a metafictive medium. First of all, in the physical form of the book. For a long time, there had been something called movable books. They were basically what we would think of as lift-the-flap books, and they were mostly used as educational tools, especially in the sciences. So you could have like an anatomy book, and you lift up the muscle, and you could see the bone, and you lift up the bone and see whatever's under bones. I don't know. But you know, they were used that way. But then with these changing attitudes about education, they started utilizing that for children's books. So you get books like The House That Jack Built, which was a very popular nursery rhyme that talked about all the different parts of a house. And they published it in the shape of a house, and you could lift the flaps and see the different parts where the rhyme talks about that part of the house, right? And that sort of started a tradition, not that book specifically, but that sort of started a tradition of interactive children's books, which we still see today with books like the Beatrice Letters, which is an extension. It's one of those supplementary books to a series of unfortunate events. As we just learned, the series of unfortunate events is very mysterious and full of suspense and intrigue and mystery. Ooh. And so the Beatrice Letters was published. It's actually a case file, and you can take, these are correspondences between Lemony Snicket and Beatrice, and it also comes with, sorry, mine's all marked up with sticky notes because I was trying to solve the mystery. This is a poster. And you can, a lot of the clues in here are removable. There are photographs in here that are just pasted in. You can take off and there's clues under them. A lot of these pages have secret perforations that you can punch out the letters and rearrange them. So you can really interact with the story, not only by feeling involved in it, but by physically interacting with it and becoming involved in solving the mystery that way, which is rad. Okay, and then we talked about the second thing, is illustration and design. So we're kind of moving from the physical form of the book to the way that they're using images. So going back into the history, I talked about how difficult it was to make books. And there was a way to mass print before the invention of the printing press. It was called block books. It's pretty much existed forever. It's basically you carve a stamp, and the stamp is an entire page of a book. And then you can stamp that page as many times as you want. But you can't use that stamp for anything else afterwards. It's pretty specifically that page of that book. And you have to carve a stamp for every page. If you have like a 100-page book, you have to carve 100 stamps just to make that book. It's a pain. It's very cumbersome. The printing press, movable type, you hear that talked about a lot. It's basically, instead of making a stamp of a whole page, you make a stamp of each letter. You can arrange them into a page, stamp that 1,000 times, then rearrange them into the next page, stamp that 1,000 times. Do your whole book that way, much quicker, much better. You can reuse it more easily. But in terms of the illustration, you're still pretty much doing woodcuts. You're still carving stamps out. So especially in children's book publishing, they wanted to only make woodcuts that they could reuse. So they only wanted to do illustrations that were very generic and not very artful, so that they could reuse them. You know, you would have your illustrated alphabet with your D for dog and your B for bird, and then you could reuse that dog and that bird in, say, Goody Two-Shoes was a very popular book, and that book totally deviated from its plot pretty frequently to talk about the irrelevant fact that Goody Two-Shoes had all these animal friends and woodland creatures that followed her around, pretty much explicitly just so that they could use those stamps that they had lying around in their publishing house. So picture books as we know them today couldn't exist in this climate because you couldn't make illustrations specific to your book, really. It wasn't until, I think, around the 19th century when lithographic printing was introduced that it just totally revolutionized. It changed the game completely. I tend to think of picture books as pre- and post-lithography. Lithography is a method of printing where instead of carving what you're printing, you're using chemical reactions. So you have a metal plate and you draw on it with an oily or waxy substance that repels water, and then you use a water-based ink so the ink doesn't stick to anywhere you drew. And that way you can pretty much print anything you want. And you can wash it clean at the end and reuse that metal plate. So there's very low commitment. And this method of printing is still in use today. It's been honed, it's been fine-tuned, and basically what it means is that people who make picture books aren't limited by technology anymore. They can do whatever the heck they want, which is awesome, and they do. Not only can picture books exist, but they can exist magnificently. So you get people being really playful and getting really creative with how they're using images in their picture books, because they can now. So you get things like The Stinky Cheese Man by John Sheska, which I want to show you one specific example from. This uses the images of the characters actually interact with the text and the other design of the book. So you have, in the middle of Chicken Licken, which is the chicken who thinks the sky is falling, the narrator jumps in and says, wait a minute, cried Jack the narrator, I forgot the table of contents. And everyone says, get away from here, you're not in this story. And then at the end of the story, the sky wasn't falling, the table of contents was, and it fell and crushed everybody. And here's the table of contents, and here's their feet sticking out the bottom, and the words are all askew because it's come crashing down, and they've all been crushed. So it's very meta, because not only do these characters know they're in a story, they're actually creating the story around themselves. And so this sort of, with lithography and with people getting more playful with how they tell stories for children, it sort of ushered in what I call the kid-lit renaissance. Because throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, children's literature has been gaining more esteem because it's able to use metafiction very, very effectively and in different ways than anyone else does. And that culture of metafiction children's literature has permeated all form of literature for young readers, even the kind that don't have pictures, like The Book with No Pictures by B.J. Novak, or, novels, which do have some pictures, but they're not like picture books. So for the most part, I'm going to talk about Lemony Snicket. He's amazing. I would call him the modern master of metafiction in any form that it takes. He just, any metafictive technique you can think of, it's like, oh yeah, that's in Series of Unfortunate Events. Oh yeah, that too, definitely. But unlike what we talked about before, where most authors are using metafiction to take us out of the fiction so that we can examine it, children's book authors use metafiction to expand the fiction and bring us into it and bring it into our world. So we're going to look at a few ways Lemony Snicket does that. I'm going to really try not to make this take too long. Okay, so he uses what are considered classic metafictive tropes. He directly addresses the reader all the time, usually to tell us not to read the book. The first book, the very opening line of the very first book is, if you are interested in stories with happy endings, you would be better off reading some other book. And he's constantly trying to get us to put the books down and walk away because he knows that we will just be so miserable if we become aware of these unfortunate events. He's just concerned for us. He interrupts his story to comment on it as a piece of writing. He does this constantly. He sometimes even acknowledges that he is interrupting. I don't have time for all the examples I want to give you. But he's always interjecting in the middle of his sentences to say, a word which here means blah, 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 blah. And he sort of interrupts in that way. At one point, he says that something is fiction and says, a word which here means somebody made it up one day, unlike the tales of the Baudelaire children, which are true, but someone just wrote them down, usually at night. He demands almost that readers examine their assumptions about what stories are and what narratives are. And I am going to give an example for this one. The opening of The Miserable Mill says, sometime during your life, in fact very soon, you may find yourself reading a book. And you may notice that a book's first sentence can often tell you what sort of story that book contains. That's the first sentence. A page later, he says, but this book begins with the sentence, the Baudelaire orphans looked out the grimy window of the train and gazed on the gloomy blackness of the finite forest, wondering if their lives would ever get any better. But it's very easy for us as readers to flip back to the first page and see that that's not the first sentence of the book. So we have to ask ourselves, at what point does the story start? When Snicket interjects, is that story? Is that fiction? What is, what isn't? We have to ask these questions, and that's what metafiction demands that we do. The most important to me, and the most prominent, the thing that people talk about most, is that he inserts himself as both an active narrative voice and sometimes as a character in the story. And in order to talk about this, because this is mostly what I want to talk about, I have to do something I really don't want to do, which is show you the next slide. So this is Daniel Handler. Daniel Handler is the author of a series of unfortunate events, and he is the creator of the Lemony Snicket persona, and it is physically painful for me to say that and break his character integrity, This picture is the picture in the About the Author page from the Reptile Room. Every About the Author page has a picture, a different picture, but they're all very similar. They're foggy, or he's at a great distance, he's wearing a big overcoat and a hat, and he's facing away from the camera. And that was the biggest mystery of my childhood. Who is Lemony Snicket? So it's very hard for me to talk about and say, Daniel Handler wrote these books. Here's who he is. Anytime that there's an event where Lemony Snicket is requested to appear, Daniel Handler attends as his publicist or his public face, or makes some excuse like that, because Lemony Snicket doesn't like to be seen in public, or is currently hiding from his enemies, or something like that. So I really don't like to talk about this, but we have to, because what I want to talk about is the very meticulous and intricate construction of the Lemony Snicket persona is so cool. And Daniel Handler is so dedicated to it and so committed. So there are a bunch of different ways you can follow. It's almost like a secondary plot. There's the plot of the Baudelaire Orphans, and there's the plot of Lemony Snicket trying to get this story told. And that plot is also full of suspense and intrigue, because he'll insert into the story that he's, even as I type this, hiding under my desk and hoping that my enemies don't hear my keys clacking, things like that. So there's a few ways you can follow it. There's the stuff in the front and end matter, which is these first three. Every book in the series is dedicated to Beatrice. They're dedicated very mysteriously. It will say, the first one is to Beatrice, dearest darling dead. The 10th one is, oh, I don't remember the 10th one, but the 12th one is to Beatrice, nothing could extinguish my love or your house. Oh, the 10th one is, when we met, you were pretty and I was lonely, now I'm pretty lonely. Things like that. The About the Author pages, I showed you one of his About the Author pictures. All of his biographies are also very mysterious, and I do want to read you one of those, because it shows you how everything he does to tell you about Lemony Snicket asks more questions than it answers. So this is his biography in the back of the 10th book. It says, until recently, Lemony Snicket was presumed to be presumed dead. Instead, this presumed presumption wasn't disproved to not be incorrect. As he continues with his investigation, interest in the Baudelaire case has increased, so has his horror. So he creates this sort of enigmatic figure that's writing these books. Also the letters to the editor. At the end of every book, there's a letter to his editor, which asks his editor to find the manuscript for the next installment, usually, hidden in some secret location. Go to this cafe, ask for this waiter, tell them this code. They'll give you 3 thimbles, which you should then take to this carnival. Stuff like that. It's very spy-y. Then we have the things within the text themselves. He hides them, and I say he hides them because he puts them directly into the text. But he hides them, he buries them under warnings for us not to keep reading because the story is so unpleasant. So sometimes he'll pile on a lot of those warnings and then start a letter to his sister. He'll say, I'm sure no one is reading anymore because I told them how unpleasant this book is. I can't imagine anyone would ever put this book off a shelf except for you because it's so unpleasant. None of my enemies would ever want to read it. This is the only safe way I could get this message to you. I hope you buy this book. Things like that. That sort of give us this idea that he is living this life of intrigue that is very routine and mundane for him. It's not routine or mundane for me or anyone I know in my world, but it is routine and mundane for the people in the world of the stories. The Baudelaire Orphans, their daily routine involves clues and codes and secrets and enemies, and it's the same for him. So we get a sense that he's living in that world. And in fact, in the 7th book, Snicket becomes a character. First, it's just Jacques Snicket, but we know that he has a mysterious brother who never shows his face in photographs. And later it is confirmed that that's Lemony Snicket. And the Snickets play a very important role in the story, so that's sort of the very blatant confirmation that he does exist within that story world. And he extends that character and that story world outside of the bounds of just these 13 books into things like his more recent series, All the Wrong Questions, which is a sort of prequel. It's in first person from the perspective of a young Lemony Snicket. It sort of chronicles how he got involved in all of this mystery and intrigue and how he got all wrapped up in it. There's also the unauthorized autobiography, which I do not have with me, unfortunately, which is mostly in the form, like the Beatrice letters, of found documents, files, pictures, letters, and give us the sense that this is a real person, and we just happen to find these artifacts of his existence. Okay, so this whole building of this persona does a couple of things. It frames the stories and gives them legitimacy because they feel like found documents. We know that they're published as fiction, but because of the things like hidden letters to his sister, it feels like he's publishing these things with a sense of urgency because they are part of his story and his mystery and his intrigue. They're part of how he's evading his enemies. It also acts as a bridge between our world and the story world. On my end of the bridge, I know that I'm real, and I'm holding this book, and it's real, and I'm reading it, and Lemony Snicket wrote it. So there must be a person named Lemony Snicket. On the other end of the bridge, Lemony Snicket exists in a world of intrigue and mystery and suspense that matches the world of the Baudelaires. So we know that he exists in that story world. And if he exists in both of those worlds, it must be the same world. This must all be real. It's extremely effective use of metafiction to give his stories legitimacy and validity. So I'm just going to wrap up a little bit. There's a place in between reality and fiction where we believe things we know to be untrue. People often call that the willing suspension of disbelief. It's when you're so engrossed in a story, you're so wrapped up in it, you know these characters aren't real, but you have real feelings about them, so they feel real. Usually authors use metafiction to take us out of that place so that we can turn around and examine it for what it is. However, children's book authors using those same metafictive techniques, whether it's John Sheska letting us watch the characters build the story around them, whether it's Dorothy Kuhnhart letting us actually pat the bunny and feel the soft fur, or whether it's Lemony Snicket building a world that's so fantastic and wonderful, but also so close and so real that even the author is a character, they expand that liminal space into the real world and invite us into it to sit comfortably and enjoy it. Thank you. So, like I mentioned before, I had a lot of things I wanted to talk about these books, so if anyone wants to talk about picture books with me later, I got nothing going on, so absolutely do that. I'm going to pack these up. Don't mind me.
Okay, I'm not sure what space we're in now, but we have Melissa Rhodes.